I used to think respect could be bought with power and that success was just a matter of numbers. I spent years commanding crowded boardrooms, dictating the fate of corporations, and treating faith as superstition, until that night in Kuala Lumpur. In an upscale restaurant, I tried to humiliate a Muslim waiter. He didn't defend himself or get angry. He simply replied calmly, "The real delay is living without God." 5 words. Silence. And a man used to moving billions realized he had never learned how to move his own heart. My name is Ethan Ross. I'm 50 years old, and I'm from the United States. For 3 decades, I was considered one of the most influential figures on Wall Street. I ran a multinational investment firm, traveled on private jets, and believed that nothing was above my logic and ambition. Before continuing my story of conversion, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. Today, every time I share it, I realize that true power doesn't lie in dominating markets, but in recognizing when the soul needs light. To the world, I seemed to be at my peak. Financial newspapers splashed my face alongside headlines about record mergers, and analysts called me the coldest mind on Wall Street. I set trends, influenced governments, and was welcomed at international conferences as if I were a head of state. Yet the higher I climbed, the thinner the air became, the kind of thinness that suffocates. With every victory came an eerie silence, the kind that not even the sound of a booming market could drown out. I had everything a man could wish for: penthouses in New York, London, and Dubai, a collection of luxury cars, and an endless list of powerful contacts. But at night, lying in a 5-star hotel bed, I felt surrounded by ghosts. Not ghosts of the past, but of the present, made of immoral deals, cold contracts, and bought smiles. When the world slept, the inner noise began. Unanswered questions. What was I really building? An empire or a prison? Insomnia became routine. The early hours, once productive, turned into long sessions of self-interrogation. I'd get up, pour a glass of whiskey, and pace in circles before the windows that showcased Manhattan's skyline. That view, the ultimate symbol of success, had become a reminder that the top can also be the loneliest place on earth. The wealth I owned was pushing people away and drawing me closer to an invisible abyss. Over time, cynicism replaced any trace of sensitivity. I began to see everything as a transaction: friendship, love, respect. Every gesture seemed to have a price. I prided myself on my coldness, until I realized it wasn't strength, but a symptom. The fear of losing control made me act as if the whole world was under my command, when in truth I couldn't even control my own mind. The third symptom was the cruelest: the fear of dying without purpose. Not the fear of death itself, but of insignificance, of leaving nothing behind but numbers on a spreadsheet. Sometimes during meetings or corporate dinners, I'd look around and see an army of people as lost as I was, hiding their emptiness behind champagne, million-dollar bonuses, and speeches about legacy. It was a collective farce. We all knew it, but no one dared to say it. In the middle of those sterile victories, a strange restlessness began to grow, like someone or something was watching me, an invisible, constant gaze. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling only intensified. Back then I blamed stress, pressure, exhaustion. Now I know it was the first call, subtle, patient, persistent, from a God I didn't yet know, but who had seen me all along. The collapse came disguised, as it always does. A quiet chart, a minor dip, a tense meeting everyone pretends to control. Within days, what seemed like a small market correction turned into an avalanche. One bad decision in an Asian investment fund triggered a chain reaction of losses. I, the so-called financial oracle, watched my empire dissolve before my eyes. In just weeks, the same analysts who once idolized me began using my name as a synonym for failure. The market is ruthless. It turns geniuses into scapegoats with a single click. My partners vanished, my board met without me, and the headlines that once glorified me now asked, how did the smartest man on Wall Street miss the obvious? The most painful part wasn't losing the money, it was losing the illusion of invincibility. For years I believed my wealth protected me from everything, from failure, loneliness, even from God. When the crisis hit, I realized how foolish that belief was. The security I had built was just a glass castle held up by ego. And when ego falls, it shatters with a sound only you can hear. The phone that never stopped ringing went silent. Messages disappeared. The people I'd made rich vanished without a trace. Even those who once called themselves brothers in arms turned into strangers overnight. It's strange how success gathers crowds and failure exposes deserts. My home, once a symbol of power, became a luxurious prison. I walked through marble halls and saw only echoes of the past. Parties, toasts, hollow applause. The paintings, the crystal glasses, the Persian rugs, they all seemed to mock me. The silence inside was deafening. I began to understand that what had truly collapsed wasn't my company, but the story I told myself to justify it all. The narrative of the invincible winner, the man who sees everything coming. When the mask fell, there was no character left, just a tired, frightened man. In the months that followed, I sold properties, settled debts, and vanished from financial headlines. Not out of strategy, but out of shame. The man who once commanded millions was now running from himself. And in that silent exile, far from glass towers and glowing screens, something began to change. For the first time in decades, I had no control. And in that emptiness where arrogance once lived, a space opened, just enough for something greater to finally enter. Before I continue, I want to say that during this time I learned that Allah asks us to care not only for our faith, but also for the body He entrusted to us. That's why I want to recommend something that can help, a practical guide to healthy living that includes how to maintain discipline, energy, and balance. And as an additional gift, this material also includes a special guide on ruqyah and spiritual protection to strengthen not only the body, but also the heart. The link is pinned in the first comment, available for a symbolic price, because what truly matters is that this message reaches those who really need it. I was in Kuala Lumpur trying to rebuild what was left of my reputation. A group of Malaysian investors wanted to hear my ideas about an international post-crisis reconstruction fund. On paper, it was supposed to be a comeback, but deep down I knew it was just desperation disguised as strategy. I traveled from city to city, repeating speeches about resilience while my own life was in ruins. That night, after a tense meeting, I decided to have dinner alone. I walked into a small restaurant near the hotel, more by chance than choice. The place was simple, dark wooden tables, warm yellow lighting, and an aroma of spices that carried both comfort and nostalgia. I was exhausted and angry. At the market, at people, at myself. I ordered some random dish, and while waiting I opened my phone to check the news. The headlines were still mocking my downfall. The waiter approached, young, with calm eyes and a soft accent. He asked where I was from and what brought me to Malaysia. I answered automatically, almost arrogantly, "Business, that's what the world needs, not prayers." He smiled, as if understanding something I wasn't yet capable of grasping. I continued, "Religion holds people back. No economy grows on its knees." The young man looked me in the eyes and said calmly, without the slightest trace of offense, "Falling behind is living without God." The sentence cut through the air like a silent lightning strike. No irony, no anger, just conviction. For a moment I felt ashamed, not because I had offended him, but because I realized the emptiness of my own words. I, who had led billion-dollar boards, had no answer for something so simple. I tried to regain control of the conversation by asking sarcastically if he believed faith could pay bills. He simply replied, "God doesn't ask man to stop working. He asks him not to lose his purpose." There was silence, and in that silence, something broke inside me. The sound of rain outside, the distant noise of cars, everything seemed to fade. All that remained was his voice, echoing in my mind, steady, serene, undeniable. When the food arrived, I no longer felt hungry. I watched that young man wiping tables with the calmness of someone at peace within himself. No sign of hurry, competition, or anxiety. And for the first time in years, I felt envy, not of what someone had, but of what someone was. I paid the bill, left a generous tip, and before leaving I thanked him. He responded with a slight nod and a phrase in Arabic that I didn't fully understand, but whose tone brought me a strange sense of peace. Alhamdulillah, praise be to God. I returned to the hotel with my mind in turmoil. Everything that young man had said seemed too simple to be ignored, and yet it was as if he had uncovered something I had never seen before. I stayed awake all night, trying to understand why those words had struck me so deeply. The man who had believed for decades that faith was a sign of weakness had just been defeated by a truth spoken between a plate of rice and a cup of tea. And the most humiliating, or perhaps the most liberating part, was that deep down I knew he was right. I lay in the bed of a luxurious hotel room, but the silence mocked me. The curtains blocked the city lights, the air conditioner hummed softly, and still all I could hear was that calm voice saying, Falling behind is living without God. I tried to convince myself it was just a phrase from a religious waiter, maybe rehearsed, maybe naive. I opened my laptop, reviewed reports, read market forecasts, and none of it made sense. Every chart looked cold, distant, meaningless. For the first time, the logic that had always guided me wasn't enough to silence the discomfort. I stood up, went to the window, and looked out over the illuminated city of Kuala Lumpur. The streets pulsed with life at every corner, and I, with all that I owned, felt dead inside. That's when the question hit me. If I have faith in nothing, what really drives me? The answer came dry, almost cruel. Fear. I had been driven by fear of losing. Money, power, relevance, respect. Everything I called ambition was just fear disguised as strength. I spent hours pacing the room, remembering all the times I had treated people like numbers, all the times I laughed at those who believed in something greater than themselves. I thought of my father, who always said that success without purpose is just vanity with a timer. I never took him seriously. Now his words sounded like prophecy. In the following days, I continued with my meeting schedule, but something had changed. During flights, presentations, and dinners with investors, the phrase echoed. It appeared in the pauses of conversations, on phone screens, in news about market crashes. I pretended everything was normal, but my mind no longer obeyed routine. One afternoon in a hotel lobby, I saw a group of Muslims preparing for prayer. One spread a small mat, another washed his face gently, and all of them aligned in silence. No one checked the time, no one looked at their phones. There was a harmony there that I had never experienced, not even in my greatest triumphs. I, the man who made others stop time for a decision, was watching people who surrendered it 5 times a day to something greater than themselves. I felt that same unease again, the same one the waiter had caused, but now it was turning into curiosity. Who was this Allah they trusted with such serenity? What kind of faith gave peace in the middle of chaos? That night, I searched in secret. Who is Allah? What is Islam? Why do Muslims pray 5 times a day? I expected to find radical or outdated explanations, but I found the opposite. I read that Allah is the same God of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, the one creator, the most merciful. I discovered that prayer wasn't mechanical repetition, but spiritual discipline, that fasting wasn't punishment but purification, that charity wasn't showmanship but a sacred duty. Each new piece of knowledge dismantled an old prejudice. I, who had prided myself on being rational, realized that logic existed there too. A divine logic, not a financial one. It was as if behind every practice there was a wisdom that spoke directly to the emptiness I had been trying to numb for years. No matter how hard I tried to resist, something inside me was surrendering. The arrogance that sustained me was crumbling, and in its place grew a restlessness that no longer fit into my old speeches about success. I began noticing details I once ignored, the way that waiter smiled effortlessly, the kindness of strangers greeting each other with "Assalamu alaikum," the way faith seemed to shape gestures, words, and priorities. Meanwhile, I carried a tired body, an empty heart, and a mind oversaturated with theories. On the last night before returning to New York, I sat alone on the hotel terrace. The city sparkled below me, but all I could whisper to myself was, "What if he's right?" The wind carried a different kind of silence, as if something or someone was listening. For the first time, I didn't just want to understand, I wanted to feel. And it was in that moment that I began to realize that the greatest bankruptcy of my life hadn't happened on Wall Street. It had happened within me, the day I confused God with irrelevance and success with purpose. I went back to the same restaurant the next morning. No reservation, no clear purpose, just driven by something that was no longer curiosity, but need. The place was almost empty, the air filled with the smell of coffee and warm bread. When I saw him coming toward me with the same calm smile, I felt a strange mix of shame and relief. "You came back," he said without surprise. "I did," I replied, trying to sound casual. I think I was left with a question stuck in my head. His name was Hafiz, a man in his early 30s, Malaysian, slim, with calm eyes and deliberate gestures. He had worked there for years, supporting his family and studying theology at night. Nothing in his posture resembled servitude. It was as if every movement, pouring water, clearing a plate, adjusting a chair, was part of a silent prayer. We sat at a table near the window. Hafiz excused himself for a few minutes, handed an order to another customer, and came back with 2 cups of tea. "Yesterday you said something to me," I began, Falling behind is living without God. He smiled without arrogance. Yes, I remember. What did you mean by that? I asked. He placed his hands on the table and spoke, not as someone trying to persuade, but as someone simply bearing witness. Many think progress means having more. But what good is it for a man to cross the world if he loses himself along the way? In Islam, we believe the heart becomes sick when it drifts away from Allah, and everything we build without Him eventually turns to dust. I stayed silent. His words hit me effortlessly. No economist, psychologist, or spiritual guru had ever spoken to me like that. It was as if he was translating what I had been feeling but couldn't explain. I always believed in merit, in work, in effort, I replied. But in the end, none of it brought me peace. Hafiz tilted his head slightly. Because peace doesn't come from control, but from surrender. When the adhan is called, it's as if the entire world reminds man, stop and remember who made you. Then he did something unexpected. He took out his phone, opened an app, and played a recording of the adhan, the call to prayer. The voice carried a melody that didn't sound human. There was something eternal in it. The sound filled the quiet room, and for a moment, everything stopped. Each word seemed to pass through layers of resistance I didn't even know were still there. When it ended, Hafiz said softly, "That's what makes me wake up in peace every day." For a few seconds I couldn't respond. I felt something in my chest, a mix of shame and relief. Shame for calling backward a man who carried more wisdom than any CEO I had ever met. Relief for realizing that maybe there was still time to understand what truly mattered. I asked him where he had learned all of that. "From the Quran," he answered. "And from life. If you want to understand, come and listen." "Listen to what?" I asked, intrigued. "The real adhan. The call echoes throughout the city, but it only reaches those who want to hear it." I agreed. Not out of faith, not yet, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of myself, of soulless meetings, of meaningless goals, of expensive dinners filled with empty words. That afternoon, Hafiz was waiting for me at the entrance of a small mosque. There was no luxury, only simplicity. Worshippers arrived barefoot, greeting each other with sincere smiles. The air carried a soft scent of wood and incense. Hafiz stood beside me and said, "When you hear the call, don't think, just feel." And then the adhan began. The voice of the muezzin filled the space, vibrating through the walls and into my chest. I didn't understand the language, but I understood the meaning. It was a call to surrender. With every verse, something in me unraveled. The rush, the pride, the fear. As the men lined up to pray, I stood still, unable to move. Hafiz placed his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Sometimes Allah speaks to us in the language of silence." At that moment, I realized I hadn't gone back to the restaurant by chance. Every step I had taken since my downfall had led me here. I, the man who believed he controlled destiny, was about to be guided by something far greater, and for the first time in years, I didn't want control. I just wanted to stay there, quiet, listening, allowing the sound of a faith I barely knew to remind me of something money could never buy, an awakened heart. The sound of the adhan still lingered in the air when Hafiz looked at me gently and said, "Feel free to observe. Here, no one forces another's heart." I stood in the corner near the wall, trying to appear invisible. The place was simple. Worn rugs, white walls, a few hanging lamps. There was no gold, no extravagant symbols, only ordinary men taking off their shoes and standing side by side. No titles, no hierarchy. The baker, the student, the driver, the doctor, all equal before the Creator. When the Imam's voice began to lead the prayer, the synchronization amazed me. Bodies bowing, rising, prostrating in a rhythm that seemed orchestrated by something unseen. The silence between each verse had a nearly tangible weight. I, so used to noisy meetings and competing voices, found myself surrounded by a stillness louder than any speech. At the moment they placed their foreheads on the ground, a chill ran up my spine. Never, in all my years of achievement, had I bowed to anything other than power, profit, or ego. There, on the cold floor of that mosque, I realized how I had spent my life standing tall before the world, but with my back turned to God. That scene, so simple, opened a crack inside me. The man who had always tried to control everything realized he was completely lost. I wanted to kneel too, but I couldn't. It was as if pride still kept me standing, trapped. Hafiz noticed. "Don't rush," he murmured. "The heart must bow before the body does." His words struck me with the force of a mirror. I, who had lived convinced that faith was superstition, began to see that perhaps true ignorance was my arrogance disguised as reason. As I watched, tears began to fall without warning. They weren't from sadness but from recognition. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing the human soul in its purest state, humbled, surrendered, sincere. When the prayer ended, no one applauded, no one raised their voice. They simply stood up in silence, some exchanged smiles and returned to their routines. I stayed there, frozen. Hafiz approached and offered me a glass of water. "What you saw here isn't perfection," he said. "It's attempt. It's man remembering that without Allah, even the air he breathes is borrowed." I had no reply. No one had ever spoken to me with such truth and calmness. Those people without wealth or status radiated something I had never possessed. Peace. A peace that didn't depend on bank accounts, contracts, or applause. A peace born from the certainty of being seen, guided, and forgiven. On the way back, the traffic of Kuala Lumpur seemed different. The honking, the billboards, the skyscrapers, all felt smaller, more distant. I looked at the people on the streets and wondered how many of them knew what that feeling of surrender was. How many, like me, spent their lives believing they were in control, when in reality, they were only running from themselves. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the hotel room with the window open, listening as the city slowly fell silent. For the first time in a long while, I wanted to speak to God, but I didn't know how. The words stuck in my throat felt useless compared to what I had witnessed. So unsure if it was allowed, I knelt. I didn't say anything. I just stayed there, silent, feeling the weight of my body against the floor and the slight tremor in my hands. There were no lights, no voices, no visions, only an emptiness that, paradoxically, began to fill. Something moved inside me, as if a dam that had held for years was beginning to crack. The opening was small but irreversible. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains and found me still kneeling in the same place. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in decades, I didn't need certainty. It was enough to keep listening to that silent voice that somehow whispered, "Now it has begun." And there, without titles, without status, without an audience, the man who once called faith a setback took his first step toward the true light. I began studying the Quran purely out of intellectual curiosity, or at least that's what I told myself. I thought I would find contradictions, mystical fragments, something easy to dismiss, but every page disarmed me. What I was reading wasn't a book that demanded blindness, but clarity. It didn't speak of escape, but of responsibility. The words were direct, firm, and yet filled with compassion. The concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God, hit me like a blow. It was simple, yet revolutionary. One creator with no intermediaries, no human agendas behind him, no manipulation, no spiritual bargaining, a God who needs no luxurious temples or applause. The idea felt almost subversive in a world where even faith becomes a product. I read about mercy and justice and realized that in Islam they aren't opposites, they are sisters. To be just is to be merciful, and to be merciful requires justice. I, who had always prided myself on being tough but fair in business, began to see that harshness has nothing to do with fairness. How many times had I used merit as an excuse to humiliate, or business as a justification to exploit? The text also introduced me to a Jesus I had never known, not the distant symbol of stained glass and sermons, but a human prophet, pure, obedient to God. And Mary, Mariam, described with such profound dignity that she seemed alive before me. It was impossible to read about her without feeling respect. It was as if the Quran was showing me that true greatness doesn't come from power, but from surrender. But the hardest blow came when I read the verses condemning usury, hollow accumulation, and purposeless consumption. There it was in black and white, everything that had sustained my former life described as injustice. Each line felt like it was pointing at me, saying, "You built empires on the ruins of others." I tried to resist, to rationalize, to argue silently against each passage. But the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't analyzing the text. The text was analyzing me. Slowly, reading stopped being intellectual and became personal. I read to understand, but ended up being understood. The Quran spoke of intentions, of silent choices, of hidden actions. It said that God sees what the eyes do not show. That broke me because if he saw everything, then he also saw the lies I told myself, that my ambition was just strategic vision, that my ego was confidence, that my pride was excellence. I remember one night in particular, I was sitting on the hotel balcony, the book open on the table, the Malaysian city pulsing below. I read a verse that said, "And he is the one who gives you life, then causes you to die, and then will bring you back to life again." I closed the book and sat still. I had never thought about death with such clarity. I, who had planned every minute of my career, had never planned what would come after my last breath. For the first time, I understood that my entire life had been an elegant denial of the inevitable. From that moment, something changed. The questions that once frightened me began to become my compass. I no longer read to prove something. I read because I needed to be transformed. The certainties I had idolized started to break one by one, until only the silence that precedes truth remained. And it was in that silence that I began to understand. What I was seeking wasn't a new belief system. It was a reunion with what had always been there, the voice that had been calling me patiently, even when I pretended not to hear it. The knowledge I was acquiring could no longer remain confined to the pages. If what I was reading was true, then it had to be lived. I began slowly, not with speeches or promises, but with actions. The first was returning $1 million bonus I had received from an unfair deal. It felt strange. Years earlier, I would have seen it as a sign of weakness. But that day, I felt relief. It was like removing a stone from my chest. Soon after, I gathered my team and completely changed the way we handled our contracts. I abolished goals that forced employees to cross ethical lines. I reduced profit margins in operations that exploited small suppliers. And the hardest of all, I faced the board of investors and told them that the company's new focus would be justice before profit. Reactions ranged from shock to outrage. Some called me naive, others a traitor to the system itself. But none of that affected me. For the first time, I was at peace with my conscience. In the following months, I experienced something I had never known in my entire career: genuine tranquility. I, who once relied on pills to sleep and caffeine to wake, began to truly rest. It was as if every right decision cleansed a little of the filth built up from years of greed and vanity. Strangely enough, the more I let go of certain profits, the more unexpected opportunities appeared. Solid partnerships, loyal clients, new projects with real purpose. The greatest change, however, wasn't financial, but internal. I discovered that living by principles brings a kind of security money can never give. It's not about trusting chance, but about trusting something greater than human control. Before, I had been the man pressing every button, calculating every move. Now I realized that true power lies in letting go. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I noticed that numbers no longer held the same fascination. The obsession with constant growth had lost its meaning. What mattered now was how that growth happened and who it benefited. I remembered a verse I had read, "And whoever puts his trust in Allah, he will be sufficient for him." That was when I understood the difference between control and trust. For decades, I had lived trying to own everything: time, destiny, people. Now, I simply did what was right and left the results in God's hands. The curious thing is, nothing fell apart. On the contrary, everything began to align. I didn't need visible miracles to believe. It was enough to realize that true transformation begins when ambition bows to faith. And during that season, I understood that living under the light of Allah wasn't about losing power. It was, finally, about finding freedom. The 10th day of Ramadan dawned differently. The air felt lighter, and within me was a serenity that didn't match the anxious man I had always been. I had fasted out of curiosity, but what I found was a purification that went beyond the body. As the sun rose, I realized I was no longer searching for answers, only courage to say what my heart already knew. In the mosque, the sound of the adhan cut through the silence and filled the space with something indescribable. Beside Hafiz, the same waiter who had confronted me weeks before, I repeated the words that changed everything. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no deity but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. My voice trembled, not from doubt but from liberation. I felt the weight of decades of pride dissolving, as if I were truly breathing for the first time. Since that moment, I have learned that faith is not theory, it's practice. I pray 5 times a day, not out of obligation, but because each prayer reminds me who truly commands time, success, and destiny. My routine changed. Business, decisions, even conversations are now filtered through something greater than ego. Today, power no longer fascinates me. It humbles me. And it's that sacred fear that keeps me on the right path. From a man who once believed in profit formulas, I became someone who seeks to serve. My company still exists, but now it invests in human, sustainable, and ethical projects. What was once vanity has become purpose, and what I once called loss was, in truth, the beginning of my salvation. If this story touched your heart, consider using Super Thanks. Your financial contribution helps this channel bring stories like mine to more people. For years, I believed power was the same as freedom. Now I know that true freedom begins when you bow before the Creator and realize that nothing is under your control, except your own surrender. The silence that once weighed on me has become a refuge, and the emptiness that once consumed me has been filled with peace. Nothing I achieved through wealth has ever come close to the lightness I found in faith. If a man who lived guided by pride could be transformed, then any heart can be reached by the mercy of Allah. Sometimes, what changes everything isn't a great revelation, but a simple gesture, a phrase, or the right moment to listen. So share this video in groups and on social media. Perhaps your action today will be the seed of someone's transformation. Watch the next video now. It might be exactly the answer your heart has been waiting for.